a small purchase, a single bad decision, even a college application? How did these things create a butterfly effect that changed the world for generations? These are the small things that changed the course of history. How did a star change the path of world religion forever? The year was 306 CE, and Constantine had just risen to the role of emperor. Like his father before him, he was a believer in the traditional Roman gods, and he was not impressed with that new faith that was gaining in popularity for the last few hundred years. Christians in Rome were still a minority, and their fate was heavily dependent on the temperament of the emperor at the time. Constantine didn't have any time for religious conflicts. He was focused on reforming Roman society, including restructuring the military and introducing a new gold coin as currency. He also battled against rebellious tribes on the frontiers and even led troops into battle personally. While he wasn't as ruthless toward the Christian minority as past emperors, he was ambivalent toward them at best, until he claimed to receive a message from God directly, which led him to convert to the new faith. But what did he actually see? He claimed to see the symbol of Jesus, a cross burning in the sky. This was enough for him, not to just end the persecution of Christians and allow for free worship, but to adopt it himself. He was baptized later in his reign as emperor, returned confiscated property to the church, and declared Sunday a day of rest for the citizens of Rome. This put the might of the entire Roman Empire behind Christianity, leading to the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, which became the greatest religious power in Europe for over a millennium, even once the Roman Empire was no more. And it all happened because Constantine likely saw not a message from God, but a celestial body, possibly a star, but modern scientists think it was likely a comet or a meteor sailing through the sky. Much of what we know as modern religion, including the evolution of faiths that developed from Christianity, likely happened because Constantine was looking up at the exact moment. Sometimes a death at the exact wrong time can stop an empire in its tracks. The name Genghis Khan still strikes fear in many people's hearts almost 1,000 years later, but another Mongol leader might have had as big of an impact. His son, Ogedei Khan, isn't quite as recognized as his father, but he might have been as strong as a military commander, if not better, and more ruthless in the treatment of his enemies. During the time as the leader of the Mongol Empire, they spread out and conquered not just Central Asia but much of China and major areas of Europe. They were one of the most powerful military forces in the world at the time, and it was entirely possible that they could have eventually conquered all of Asia and Europe. From there, who knows? With the riches they were gaining, they could have easily built a naval fleet that would allow them to travel to other continents. But there was one thing Ogedei Khan couldn't plan for. Just like his father, he was mortal. And when the end came, everything fell apart. Ogedei died not in a heroic battle, but due to persistent problems with his digestive tract. The infamously ruthless ruler was felled by tummy trouble, and the norms of Mongols meant that they had to retreat back home to conduct the election to pick a new Khan. The only problem was the Mongols were not bound by Ogedei's choice. A 5-year power struggle ensued, limiting the Mongols' reach in the coming decades. His successor, Guyuk, faced a challenge to his leadership from rival tribesman Batu and died in battle against him. Batu managed to restore the Mongol fighting machine, but it would be over 10 years before the Mongol army was ready to make another push into Europe. And as Batu got ready to make his move, he too died, bringing an end to the Mongol plan for global domination. Sometimes a minor omission can lead to a major military fallout. The U.S. Civil War was raging and the Confederate Army had faced some rough waters. Several generals had been dismissed, but they had hope in the promising General Robert E. Lee. Lee's sharp mind and superior tactics had led to several surprising victories. The Confederates were fighting the United States on their border, and the Maryland campaign was seen as key to driving the Union back. So Lee issued Special Order 191, a general movement order detailing extensive plans for the Confederate troops on September 9, 1862. The key was a plan to capture Harper's Ferry, and it was to be distributed to several Confederate generals. Lee's officer, Robert H. Chilton, took dictation on the orders, made several copies, gave them Lee's stamp of approval, and handed them over for distribution. But for whatever reason, one wound up in the wrong hands. It was 4 days later when the 27th Indiana Volunteers, a Union military unit, marched into the area. A young man named Corporal Barton W. Mitchell noticed an envelope on the ground. It had 3 cigars in it. His lucky day! But before Corporal Mitchell could smoke it up, he noticed something odd about the paper it was wrapped in. It was a copy of Special Order 191. He quickly handed it over to his sergeant, who passed it on up the chain until it wound up in the hands of his commander of the Army of the Potomac. Suddenly, they had details on just about every major Confederate troop movement in the coming battles. The Union soldiers got the drop on the Confederates. They won the Maryland campaign and successfully pushed the Confederates back south. This gave the Union a major confidence boost. improved Lincoln's political fortunes, and helped pave the way for the Emancipation Proclamation. That was some costly littering. Being an admissions director is challenging, but rarely is it this significant. The Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna was one of Europe's crown jewels. Not only was it one of the best places to study the history of art or practice your craft in paint and sculpture, but it was incredibly diverse and cosmopolitan for the time. It was a hub of culture in the early 20th century, and getting in was not easy. They rejected many promising applicants and even more non-promising ones, like Adolf Hitler, who applied twice in 1907 and 1908. The aspiring painter moved to Vienna to apply only to be rejected and stayed in the city to try to sell his paintings. By 1913, he would leave for Munich. And when he returned, it would be under very different circumstances. No one knows what would have happened if Hitler got into the academy. He wasn't a great painter, so maybe he would have flunked out. Maybe he would have still found his love for far-right politics and brought them to the liberal academy. But what did happen is that in Munich, he found like-minded people who were willing to follow his right-wing ideology. After a failed coup, a prison sentence, and a disturbingly fast rise to power in Germany, he returned to Austria and took over that country just a year before the start of World War II. And under German occupation, the proud institution was forced to purge its student body and faculty of Jews and comply with Nazi dogma, something Hitler likely took some personal pleasure in. But sometimes misfortune can lead to great fortune. Ole Kirk Christiansen was a humble man. A carpenter from Denmark, he worked as a carpenter's apprentice and fought his way out of poverty. He bought a small woodworking business in 1916 and focused on restoring local businesses and producing household goods. He was also raising a family, but then tragedy struck. His two sons, Carl George and Gottfried, were playing with wood shavings in the workshop when some embers caught fire. The whole family was able to get out alive, but the business and the family's home were both destroyed. Christensen was at rock bottom, but was able to rebuild and expand his business. The larger workshop would be a mixed blessing when the Great Depression hit Denmark in the 1930s. He was forced to lay off staff and man the building himself, and refocused on making cheap wooden toys for children. And one type of toy caught on in particular. While his business as he knew it was no longer profitable, his blocks made from birchwood were popular with locals. When he faced bankruptcy, he let his old woodworking business go and focused on toys rather than carpentry. And the new company he started would eventually become the Lego Group. While the toys caught on slowly and expansion was hampered by World War II in the region, he would eventually buy a plastic molding machine in 1974, and the rest is history. While Ole Kirk Christensen would die in 1958, his son Gottfried, the young firebug himself, would take over management and build it up into one of the largest toy brands in the world, complete with a hit movie series. Would any of it have happened if a simple carpenter didn't face fires and economic downturns? The world may never know. We've all probably told our boss to take that job and shove it once or twice, but rarely with these consequences. David Blair was a merchant seaman who had attained a prominent position, a crew member on the White Star Line, one of the premier cruise lines in the world. And what's more, he was about to make history, being appointed to serve on the most impressive liner in the world, the Titanic, on its maiden voyage. He sailed with the ship on its trial voyages and everything looked like smooth sailing, but plans changed in a hurry. The White Star Line decided at the last minute to bring in the chief officer from the Olympic, Henry Wilde, to take over the position on the Titanic. The ship's two top officers were both demoted one step down, and Blair, the third in rank on the ship, was bumped off the Titanic entirely. He was less than pleased, writing to his sister-in-law that he was disappointed to miss out on history. He had no idea how right he was due to one simple omission. Blair had switched ships in a hurry, and when he vacated the Titanic, he left with one important item: the key to the crow's nest locker. The locker kept the binoculars that the lookouts would use locked securely away, which raised the question: if the lookouts had the binoculars available, would they have been able to see a certain iceberg coming? David Blair's absent-minded pocketing of the Titanic's key was brought up during the many inquiries about the deadly sinking, and the lookouts on duty said they were told there would be no binoculars available. Was this part of the plan, or simply a story the company came up with after the fact? While Blair continued his career after the Titanic's sinking, even becoming a hero when he jumped into the water to rescue a drowning man a year later, the key remained in the people's minds. His daughter eventually donated it to the International Sailors Society, where it was purchased by Chinese investors. How could a slight change in route accidentally cause World War I? The events that led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand were a long time in the making, but they almost never happened. The presumptive heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was seen as a representative of the empire's power. A group of young radicals was ready to take action with the hope of advancing their cause for independence. 6 conspirators of Bosnian descent plotted to assassinate the Archduke and his wife as they visited Sarajevo, and they planned it ruthlessly. The group had bombs, pistols, and worked through a network of safe houses in the city. The 6 assassins were placed among the motorcade route, but when they made their move, things started to go wrong. One assassin threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and damaged the car behind it. The motorcade sped up and safely delivered the Archduke to his destination at Town Hall. The plot had been an embarrassing failure so far. The rattled Archduke gave his speech, and security team decided to visit the wounded in the hospital. Gavrilo Princip, one of the assassins who had gotten away in the initial chaos, staked out a position in front of a local sandwich shop. Was he planning out the Archduke's route, or was he just stress-eating? The world will never know, but what we do know is that the Archduke's car turned onto the wrong street, stopping in front of the sandwich shop as it tried to reverse. That gave Princip the opportunity he needed, and the young assassin quickly did what the complex terror attack before failed to. He stepped up to the car and shot both the Archduke and his wife at close range. The 2 were fatally wounded. Princip was arrested, and Serbia was soon engulfed in a diplomatic crisis. Austria-Hungary would soon declare war on Serbia, Germany would take their side, and the second most brutal war in history would start. Maybe because one assassin was hungry that day. Sometimes events take decades to play out. In the early 20th century, Vietnam was under French occupation. Like many countries around the world, it was a colonial holding and the country's natural resources were exploited. But a growing youth movement for independence was building, and many of them traveled around the world. One of them was Ho Chi Minh, who came from a middle-class family and had the opportunity to live abroad. While he visited France and Britain during the 1910s, he found one place he connected with more than any other: the United States. He worked as a chef in Boston and developed a love for the country, so much so that he even thought that its leader could help the country. As the world restructured itself in the aftermath of the First World War, Ho Chi Minh saw a similarity between his own country's battle for independence and the one the U.S. fought in 1776. Perhaps the President Woodrow Wilson would support his cause. What could go wrong? Ho Chi Minh penned a passionate letter to Wilson amid the backdrop of the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference. No one is sure what happened next, but we do know that he never received a response. Maybe Wilson didn't support his cause. Maybe he was preoccupied and his team never gave him the petition. Maybe he was in poor health due to a stroke he suffered in the middle of the lengthy negotiations. One thing's for sure, Ho Chi Minh did not maintain his love for the United States after this snub. In the 1920s, he became a communist and turned his focus to revolution during the 1940s. While he did briefly work with the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War, it's impossible to look at the eventual consequences of the Vietnam War and wonder, what if Wilson had responded to that letter? Speaking of World War II, how did a birthday party help turn the tide of a war? It was do-or-die time for the Allies. A possible victory against Hitler had become a bleak concept, with the Nazis occupying much of mainland Europe and viciously bombing Great Britain. But now they had new hope. The Americans were coming. Hitler had foolishly declared war on the USA in solidarity with Japan after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and now the entire war would hinge on one critical battle, D-Day, the storming of the beaches of Normandy. But the Americans were coming into rough waters. They were entering into enemy territory, and worst of all, they would be facing one of the most ruthless and brilliant generals in history, the German warrior Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox. But the Americans who landed didn't find the well-oiled German war machine that day. In fact, the Nazis' army seemed to be unprepared for them. Where was the Desert Fox? It turned out it was his wife's birthday, and he had been given leave to attend her party. Complicating things further, the commander of the feared 21st Panzer Division was away from the battlefield as well, spending time in Paris with his mistress. While the Americans still sustained heavy losses and faced brutal conditions as they headed into France, they were able to establish a beachhead in the country and move into Europe from there. Rommel's feared war machine never quite deterred the Americans, and the losses only enraged Hitler further, weakening the Nazi hold on Europe and eventually leading to many generals, including Rommel, plotting to remove the Nazi leader from power. Did the Americans know Rommel would likely be absent when they set the date of the invasion? It's unknown, but the date of Lucy Rommel's birth might have boosted the Allies when they needed it most. It wasn't the only time a vacation saved millions of lives. Alexander Fleming was hard at work studying the nature of microorganisms and diseases. During the First World War, he was key in trying to minimize casualties by developing antiseptics that would prevent infection while not injuring the patients more severely. However, his innovations weren't fully adopted by the military. He would later discover the natural antimicrobial enzyme lysozyme. and increase understanding of our immune system. But his greatest discovery would come by accident. In 1927, he was experimenting with staph bacteria and took 2 weeks off to spend a vacation with his family. When he returned, he noticed that one of the samples had developed a fungus, contaminating the sample. Or so he thought. On further inspection, he discovered that the fungi hadn't just surrounded the bacteria, it had killed the staph bacteria. He investigated the mold and found it was from the genus Penicillium. Working on cultivating it, it became clear that this mold had a powerful inhibiting effect on bacteria, far better than any antibiotic substance discovered up to this point. When he published a paper on his findings, reaction was slow. How exciting could another announcement on fungus be? But when other scientists refined the process and made it easier to produce penicillin in large amounts, it started to catch on. Soon it would be the premier antibiotic in the world, and Fleming would receive a knighthood for his efforts. Would any of this have happened if Fleming's family didn't pull him away from his lab for a well-deserved vacation? Sometimes light can bloom in the darkness. In the 1970s, New York City was a powder keg. A poor economy, high crime, and a presidential administration that wasn't interested in helping set the city up for disaster. And disaster arrived on July 13, 1977. During a heat wave, the city's power infrastructure failed and plunged almost the entire city into darkness for close to 2 days, and sent most of the city into a panic. Some people responded by bunkering down in their homes, trying to keep their families safe and helping their neighbors. Others had less helpful approaches to the crisis, including rioting, arson, and looting. It was one of the worst days for crime in the city's history, with 134 stores looted, 45 stores set ablaze, and over 500 police officers injured, and over 4,000 looters ultimately arrested. But many looters got away with it, and some took some interesting items. While many of the rioters just took whatever they could, others used the opportunity to grab items that they had their eyes on for a while from already looted stores, including a young man named Curtis Brown, only 17 years old at the time. He admitted he stole a sound mixer from a music store and used it to launch his career as a hip-hop DJ, one of the pioneers in the field. Many people in the field say that there seemed to be a lot more DJs after the blackout, although others say the impact of the blackout is overstated on hip-hop's launch. Brown soon took on the stage name Grandmaster Caz and went on to influence legends of music including Will Smith and Jay-Z. While the blackout waged a terrible toll on New York City, some used it to help launch a new genre of music that changed the world. Sometimes a misspoken word can change the course of history. The year was 1989, and the Iron Curtain was still high over Europe, dividing it between the spheres of influence of NATO and the Soviet Union. Nowhere was this more evident than in Germany, where the country was split down the middle between a democracy and a communist dictatorship, divided by a powerful wall in the city of Berlin. As the Soviet Union began to falter and liberalize its policies, many Germans demanded freedom of travel between the two sides, especially with many families split down the middle by the wall. Günter Schabowski had the unenviable job of calming the tension one November day. There had just been a change in leadership, and Schabowski was the new spokesman, addressing policy changes. The government issued new travel rules, liberalizing border controls, and he was in charge of explaining them to the people. To say he did not do a great job would be putting it lightly. While the regulations made it easier to travel between the two sides of Germany, Schabowski mistakenly said that all travel regulations were suspended. This led to mass jubilation, and then mass outrage as people realized it wasn't the case. Soon, huge numbers of East Berlin residents were at the wall, demanding to be let through. The guards were massively outnumbered and had no choice but to start letting people through the gates. A spontaneous celebration erupted, where citizens began taking down the wall piece by piece, with many taking bits of the wall as souvenirs. The images went around the world, and it was the biggest sign yet that the Soviet Union was on its last legs. Sure enough, a few years later, an attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev's moderate leadership by communist radicals was foiled, and Gorbachev was replaced by Russia's first democratically elected leader. In some cases, one hit can change the sports world. Drew Bledsoe was a strong quarterback, and while he never won a Super Bowl for the Patriots, he had led them to the playoffs 4 times and even became the youngest player ever named to the All-Star game. In 2001, the season was off to a bad start as the Patriots had dropped their first game to the Cincinnati Bengals. In their second game against the New York Jets, Bledsoe was hit by Jets linebacker Mo Lewis, just as Jets defensive end Sean Ellis knocked Bledsoe off balance. Bledsoe seemed to have suffered a concussion, but after the game it became clear that he was much more seriously injured. He had suffered a near-fatal tear in a blood vessel in his chest and was bleeding internally. He underwent emergency surgery and the doctors managed to save his life, but he would be out of action for a long time. The Patriots' backup quarterback got the call up, an unknown by the name of Tom Brady. While Brady was unable to win the second game of the season, he led the Patriots to victory in the third game and eventually took the Patriots from an opening record of 0-2 to a final record of 11-5, good enough for the playoffs. The team tore through the opposition and won the Super Bowl that year, with Bledsoe eventually playing again as Brady's backup during the playoffs. However, Brady was now the new starter and would lead the Patriots to one of the greatest football dynasties of all time. And it almost never happened. He was barely drafted into the NFL in the first place and was unlikely to be traded to any other team if Bledsoe didn't get injured. While neither man committed any violation of the rules, Lewis and Ellis's bad timing led to the rise of one of the NFL's greatest legends, who would torment the Jets for the next 25 years. How did a bad marriage lead to the rise of a president? The year was 2004 and Jack Ryan was riding high. The former investment banker for Goldman Sachs had a net worth in the tens of millions, and now he wanted to parlay that wealth into a United States Senate seat from Illinois. He easily won the Republican nomination on a moderate platform and had high hopes for the fall. His opponent was a state senator who had recently lost a congressional race, and while Illinois leaned to the Democratic side, Ryan had the cash to swamp his opponent. There was just one problem. Ryan was the ex-husband of the popular Star Trek actress Jeri Ryan, and the two waged a nasty custody battle in 1999. The records were sealed, but as he ran for office, his opponents petitioned for them to be released. It was revealed that Jack Ryan had been emotionally abusive to his wife, wanted her to engage in public sex with him, and liked to visit sex clubs. Needless to say, the reaction was swift. Jack Ryan had an image as a wholesome family values candidate, and the disclosures blew that up. He immediately lost support of the party, and less than a week later, he was forced to drop out. The Republicans needed a new candidate, and they settled on Alan Keyes, a controversial political pundit without long roots in Illinois. And that's how Illinois State Senator Barack Obama went from being in a tough race against a powerhouse millionaire to essentially being able to walk into the Senate. That same year, he got a key speech at the Democratic National Convention, which made him a rising star. And only 4 years later, he was elected President of the United States. And his path to get there was a lot smoother because 10 years earlier, Jack Ryan had some dirty habits. But maybe no modern move had more political implications than what one TV executive did in the early 2000s. As the 2000s dawned, NBC was riding high and its new president, Jeff Zucker, was inheriting a lot of success. But there was trouble brewing. The network's signature Thursday night must-see TV comedy block was a shadow of its former self. Seinfeld was gone, Friends was getting close to the end of its run, and few of the replacements were catching on. Remember Veronica's Closet? Working? Yeah, us either. NBC needed something new to catch the public's eye, and they got their opening from their rival CBS. The show Survivor was the hottest thing on TV, and suddenly everyone wanted their own reality TV competition. Zucker decided to follow suit, but he'd give his shows an NBC superstar twist. The two hosts he picked would have world-altering implications. The first of the two big NBC reality TV hits of the early 2000s was Fear Factor, a gross-out stunt show that had contestants eating bugs and riding on moving cars to earn money. Critics hated it, and audiences loved it. And to host the show, Zucker picked former news radio comedian and UFC commentator Joe Rogan. And then there was The Apprentice, a business-based competition where job seekers competed to earn a position with a prominent real-life businessman. The host of The Apprentice would be the colorful New York real estate magnate Donald Trump. Neither Rogan nor Trump were obscure before being hired, but the two gained massive new exposure from the shows. Rogan parlayed his success into becoming one of the world's most successful and controversial podcasters, and as for Trump, well, you know the rest. For major effects on the future of the world, check out The Worst Days in the History of the World, or watch how Agent 355 changed the course of the American Revolution for another key turning point.